The train
We,
arrived
we can't
late.
turn
It
back
always
now.
arrived
It's
late
too
into
risky.
Redstone,
But what if the
Colorado,
posse
as
is
though the
waiting?
locomotive
We
itself
fight. No other
understood that
choice.
this particular town
I'm
deserved
here
no
for what's
urgency,
mine.
no
This
ceremony,
land isn't yours
no
to
grand
take.
announcement
Hold on
of its own
now.
importance.
We'll see.
The whistle cut through the cold
Almost at
April
the valley's
air
end.
like a blade finding
Beautiful
old scar
here.
tissue,
It
and the
is.
platform filled with the usual noise of a frontier town receiving its weekly supply of goods and strangers. Colt Hargrove stood at the far end of the platform with his hat pulled low and his arms crossed over his chest, watching the passenger cars slow to a stop. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders in the way that comes not from vanity, but from years of work that does not stop for weather or grief or the quiet collapse of a man's interior life. His face was the kind of face that the Colorado sun had worked on for a long time, carving lines around his eyes and across his forehead that made him look older than 38, or perhaps simply more weathered than age alone could accomplish. He was not a man who smiled easily. He was not lately a man who smiled at all. He had the letter folded in his breast pocket. He had read it enough times that he could have recited it from memory, though he was not the sort of man who recited things. The letter was from Brother Callum, a missionary who ran a small outpost 60 miles east, near the edge of the territory where the land opened up into something older and stranger than the Colorado most men knew. Brother Callum had written in careful, unhurried script about a healer. Someone trained in the old ways of the land and in whatever medical texts had passed through the mission over the years. Someone with hands steady enough and a mind sharp enough to handle what a frontier ranch demanded. The letter had not mentioned a name. It had not mentioned much of anything about the person beyond their skill and their availability, and Brother Callum's personal endorsement, which he had offered in terms strong enough that Colt had trusted it without asking further questions. He was about to understand that this had been a mistake in judgment, though not in the way he expected. The passengers began to descend, drummers with sample cases, families with too much luggage and not enough certainty in their eyes, a minister in a coat that had seen better decades, two miners returning from somewhere that had clearly not made them rich. Then the platform shifted, not physically, not in any way that could be measured or described to a man who had not been standing there at that particular moment. But the atmosphere of the place changed the way the air changes before a storm, that pressurized stillness that arrives before anything visible happens. She came down the steps of the third car carrying a leather satchel in one hand and nothing else. She moved with the unhurried precision of someone who had learned long ago that rushing rarely changed outcomes. Her dark hair was braided back from her face. She wore a plain traveling dress that had been mended in two places and was still cleaner than anything most people on that platform owned. Her face was angular and composed, the kind of composed that is not the absence of feeling, but the mastery of it. She was Apache. There was no ambiguity about this. The bone structure of her face, the particular darkness of her eyes, the way she stood on that platform and looked at the town of Redstone as though she was cataloging it rather than fearing it, all of it was unmistakable to anyone who had spent time in this territory. And everyone on that platform had spent time in this territory. The noise did not stop all at once. It tapered the way a river narrows before it drops, conversations falling off one by one as people turned and registered what they were seeing. A woman, Apache, alone, with a leather bag that suggested she had come here with a purpose. Tatum Creel was the first to move. He was the sheriff of Redstone County, a man of 48 who had the physical appearance of someone who had once been dangerous and was now merely threatening, which is a different thing entirely. He was broad through the chest with a lawman's badge that caught the pale April light and a way of walking that announced his authority before he opened his mouth. He crossed the platform with his hand resting near his holster. Not on it, near it. The distinction was intentional. "You there?" His voice carried the particular flatness of a man accustomed to not being questioned. "This platform is for ticketed passengers. You need to state your business or move along." She looked at him the way a person looks at an obstacle they have already calculated how to navigate. She reached into her satchel and produced a folded letter. "I have business here," she said. Her English was precise and unhurried. "I was sent for." Creel did not take the letter. Sent for by who? By the man who wrote to Brother Callum's mission requesting a healer. The crowd on the platform had thickened now. People were not leaving. People were doing the thing that crowds in frontier towns have always done, staying still and watching, because a man's boredom can dress itself in many costumes and Righteous suspicion is one of the more comfortable ones. Creel's eyes moved over her with an assessment that had nothing to do with the law and everything to do with something older and uglier. His jaw tightened. I don't know anything about a mission or a healer, he said. What I know is that we've had trouble with Apache in this county, and I'm not inclined to. I believe, said a voice from the far end of the platform, that you're talking to someone I invited. The crowd separated. Colt Hargrove walked toward them at the same measured pace he always used, which was the pace of a man who has learned that running toward trouble rarely improves it. His boots struck the platform boards with a rhythm that was neither aggressive nor hesitant. He reached into his breast pocket and took out his own copy of Brother Callum's letter without looking away from Creel. He stopped 3 feet from them both. He looked at the woman for the first time at close range. She was younger than he had expected, though he realized immediately that he had been picturing a man and had therefore not been expecting anything at all about her. She met his gaze directly with those dark cataloging eyes and said nothing. He looked at the letter in her hand and then at the letter in his own hand. He compared them for a moment, the handwriting, the seal at the bottom, the careful script of Brother Callum's endorsement. Everything matched. The platform was very quiet. Colt folded his letter back into his pocket. Miss, he said, and the word came out more careful than he had intended. I'm Colt Hargrove. I own the Broken Spur Ranch about 4 miles north of town. I wrote to Brother Callum's mission 6 weeks ago, asking him to recommend someone with medical training who might be willing to work in this area. He paused. He recommended you. He did, she said. You have training. I do. He looked at Creel then, and something passed between those two men that had nothing to do with friendship and everything to do with a long-standing calculation of power and consequence. Creel had something Voss wanted done. Colt had something that Creel had not yet found a legal reason to take from him, but was working on it. She's here on my invitation, Colt said. His voice had not risen, it would not rise. If you have a problem with that, you can bring it to the circuit judge next time he passes through. He paused, which I believe is 6 weeks from now. Creel's hand had not moved from the vicinity of his holster. For a moment, the calculation behind his eyes was visible, risk-reward timing witnesses, and then the hand dropped to his side. Your ranch, your problem, Creel said, but don't say I didn't warn you. He walked away. The crowd did not disperse immediately, because crowds rarely do, but the sharpness went out of the moment the way a wire releases tension when the weight is removed. Colt turned back to the woman. Do you have more luggage? No, he nodded once. Then we can go. She walked beside him off the platform, and he did not offer to carry her satchel, and she did not offer any expression of gratitude. And later, when he thought back on those first few minutes, he would understand that this was the precise moment when the shape of things became clear to him, even if he could not yet name what it was he was seeing. Her name was Saya. She told him this in the wagon about a mile outside of town, when the silence had gone on long enough to become a kind of conversation of its own. She did not offer more than the name, and he did not ask for more than the name, and they rode the remaining 3 miles to Broken Spur in a quiet that was not comfortable exactly, but was at least honest. The ranch came into view as the wagon crested the last low rise before the valley floor, and Colt watched her face as she saw it for the first time. He had done this with other people, hands he was hiring, men he was negotiating with, and he had learned that a person's first look at Broken Spur told him something useful. She did not react with the visible relief that people who had been sleeping in poor conditions often showed. She did not react with the faint contempt that some people from towns brought to anything built of wood and hard work rather than brick and commerce. She looked at the main house, the barn, the bunkhouse, the corrals, the small outbuildings scattered across the yard like a sentence, whose words had been arranged by practicality rather than aesthetics. And she looked at all of it with the same cataloging attention she had given to Tatum Creel and to him. He would learn over the weeks that followed that this was simply how she looked at everything. Dutch Garner was waiting in the yard. He was 55 years old and had worked this land for over a decade, first for Colt's father and then for Colt himself, and his face had the particular quality of a man who has seen enough of the world to have stopped being surprised by most of it. He looked at Saya when the wagon pulled in. He looked at Colt. Some form of private calculation moved through his eyes and then settled. Ma'am, he said, removing his hat. Mr. Garner, she said. This appeared to satisfy him because he replaced his hat and went back to what he had been doing. Colt showed her to the room that would be hers, a small space off the back of the main house that had its own door to the outside, its own window facing east, and a lock that worked from the inside. He had added the lock 2 weeks ago when he had begun seriously preparing for whoever Brother Callum was going to send. He was not sure what had made him add it. He was glad now that he had. "The lock works from inside," he said. "You have the only key." She looked at the lock and then at him, and something in her expression shifted by a degree so small it was almost invisible. Almost. "Thank you," she said. He left her to settle in and went back to the main house, which was by any honest accounting a disaster. He had been living alone in it for 5 years, and he had reached some private agreement with himself at some point during those 5 years that certain standards of housekeeping were a luxury he could not afford the emotional energy to maintain. The kitchen table had 4 months of account books on it. The floor needed attention. The curtains in the main room were the curtains Sarah had chosen, and he had not touched them, which meant they had not been washed in 5 years, which was a fact he had simply chosen not to think about. He sat at the table and looked at the account books and did not read them. He thought about the moment on the platform when he had made his choice. He had not experienced it as a choice, not exactly. It had felt more like arithmetic. Brother Callum's letter was genuine. The woman's credentials were confirmed. She had been invited, and therefore she had a right to be there, and therefore anyone who threatened that right was in the wrong. Simple. But he knew sitting in the silent kitchen with the late afternoon light falling through unwashed windows that nothing about what had happened on that platform was going to remain simple. Edmund Voss would see to that. Voss ran the only general store in Redstone County, which meant that in the practical language of frontier economics, he ran Redstone County. He set prices. He extended or withdrew credit. He determined what was available and what was not. He had done this for 15 years with the calm efficiency of a man who understood that a monopoly properly maintained was more durable than any amount of goodwill. He was also cold suspected doing something else. Something that had to do with the land surveys that had been conducted quietly over the past year, and the way certain small ranchers had been squeezed out of their properties through a combination of inflated prices and called-in debts, and the way those properties had subsequently been acquired through channels that were technically legal but practically opaque. Colt did not yet know the full shape of it. He knew enough to know that Voss was building towards something, and that whatever it was going to be bad for anyone whose land happened to be in the way. He looked at the account books for a moment longer. Then he got up and started cleaning the kitchen. It was the first time he had cleaned the kitchen properly in 5 years. He was not entirely sure why he was doing it now at this particular moment. He told himself it was practical. He told himself it was simply the sensible thing to do when someone new had come to work in the house. He told himself a number of things that evening, alone in the kitchen with his hands in soapy water, and most of them were true in the way that partial truths are true. The next morning, Saya rose before dawn. He knew this because he also rose before dawn, as he always did, and when he came through the kitchen to start the stove, he found it already lit, the coffee already made, and Saya standing at the kitchen window watching the darkness dissolve over the eastern pastures. She turned when he entered. She did not appear startled. "I made coffee," she said. "I see that." He poured a cup and stood at the other window, the one that faced the barn, and they drank coffee in silence while the sky changed from black to the particular deep blue that precedes full dawn in the high country. Outside, the horses were beginning to move in the corral. "I'll need to understand the ranch's needs," she said after a while. "The men, any existing injuries or illnesses, what supplies you have, what you don't. Dutch can show you the bunkhouse this morning. I'll have the men line up and you can assess them. And the supplies situation. Limited, the nearest doctor is in Crestfield, 40 miles east. He comes through twice a year if the weather cooperates. Before you arrived, we handled most things ourselves." She nodded. "Then I'll need to build what I don't have." "Voss runs the only store in the county." Something passed through her eyes at the name. Quick, then gone. "I noticed his store when we passed through to town yesterday," she said. "Then you noticed the prices posted in the window." "I noticed them." He looked at her directly for the first time that morning. "He sets his prices at whatever he determines. There's no competition within 30 miles. Most ranchers in this valley are in debt to him one way or another. Including you." "Not yet. I've been careful." He set down his coffee cup. I order direct from Denver when I can. Takes longer, but it keeps my costs honest. Voss doesn't appreciate it. I suspect, she said, that Voss doesn't appreciate quite a number of things. This was, he would understand later, Saya's way of indicating that she was paying attention to something larger than the immediate conversation. At the time, he registered it simply as a sharp observation and filed it away with the other information he was accumulating about this woman who had arrived on his platform and stood in his kitchen and watched the sunrise like someone reading a language written in light. The first week established patterns. Saya moved through the ranch with the same deliberate attention she brought to everything. She assessed the men with a thoroughness that initially made them uncomfortable and eventually made them confident. Dutch had a knee that had been quietly worsening for 3 years. She adjusted the way he was wrapping it, prepared a compound from materials she had brought in her satchel, and told him it would improve over the next month. He looked at her with the particular skepticism of a man who has been told things by doctors that did not come true. And she met his skepticism without flinching, and by the end of the second week, his knee had improved enough that he stopped favoring it on the steps. Emmett Dre, the ranch's best shot and most experienced trail hand, watched her with an expression that Colt could not quite read. Not hostility exactly, not warmth, something more calculating, more patient, like a man sitting at a card table who has not yet decided what kind of game he is playing. The town of Redstone made its feelings known in the ways that small towns always do, which is to say loudly and through channels that preserve the speaker's ability to deny the specific content of what was said. Mildred Voss Edmonds' sister, and the most efficient transmitter of opinion in the county, began circulating the version of events in which Cole Hargrove had either lost his mind or lost his morals, and the only uncertainty was, which was worse. Saya heard this? Of course she heard it. A frontier town is not built for privacy. She did not visibly react. This Colt would come to understand was not the absence of feeling. It was a discipline built over years of knowing that certain audiences would use your pain as confirmation of whatever they already believed about you. She had learned to give those audiences nothing. It was in the second week that the first real confrontation came. She had ridden into Redstone alone. Colt had offered to accompany her, and she had declined, which he had accepted after one moment of hesitation, that he hoped she had not noticed to purchase specific items from Voss's store that she could not source from the ranch's own supplies. She had a list written in precise handwriting. She presented it to the clerk, a thin young man who looked at her and then at the list, and then over his shoulder to where Edmund Voss was standing near the back of the store watching the interaction with his arms folded, and his expression carrying the studied neutrality of a man who has decided in advance what he is going to allow to happen. I'm afraid several of those items are out of stock, the clerk said. She looked at the shelves behind him where 3 of the items on her list were clearly visible. I can see them from here, she said. The clerk turned red. There may have been a mistake in the inventory, he said. From the back of the store, Voss spoke. We reserve the right to decline service to anyone who may pose a disruption to our other customers. His voice was smooth and deliberate, the voice of a man who had been refusing people things for a long time and had found the most efficient language for doing so. I'm sure you understand. She looked at Voss. He looked at her. Neither of them moved. She turned, picked up her satchel, and walked out. She did not raise her voice. She did not make a scene. She did not give Edmund Voss anything he could use. When she returned to Broken Spur and told Colt what had happened, his face did something she had not seen it do before. The lines around his eyes went tight, and a muscle in his jaw moved once deliberately like something being contained. I'll order the supplies from Denver, he said. It'll take 10 days. I know, she said. I'm sorry. She looked at him for a moment. You didn't do it. I know I didn't do it. I'm still sorry it happened. She studied him with those dark cataloging eyes, the eyes that had assessed the station platform and the ranch yard and the bunkhouse full of rough men, the eyes that had looked at Tatum Creel and taken his measure in under 5 seconds, and she said nothing more. But something in her assessment of him shifted in a direction he would not be able to name for several weeks. It was the apology that did it, not because it was extraordinary, because it was genuine. In her experience, genuine apologies from men who had not personally committed the offense were rarer than most people acknowledged. The evening of the 11th day, Colt came back from the far pasture later than usual and found Saya in the main room sitting at the table he had cleared of account books working by lamplight on something he could not immediately identify. She had small bowls arranged in a precise row, and she was working with dried plant material from a collection of cloth pouches, grinding and measuring with the focused intensity of a craftsman. He sat down across the table from her, not close enough to crowd the work, and poured himself a cup of the coffee that had been keeping warm on the stove. "What is that?" he asked. "A compound for joint inflammation. Your foreman's knee is responding, but there's an underlying issue I want to address more directly." He watched her hands work. They were steady and precise, the hands of someone who had been doing skilled work for a long time. He found himself thinking about the night 5 years ago, when he had ridden 40 miles to Crestfield in a February storm trying to find the doctor, and how the doctor had not been there, had been called out to a mine accident 20 miles further east, and how by the time he had returned to Broken Spur the next morning, Sarah was already. He stopped that line of thought. He had become practiced at stopping it. But something about watching Saya's hands work in the lamplight made the stopping harder than usual. "Where did you learn?" he asked. She did not look up. "Both places my father's people have healers. I learned what they knew from the time I was very young." A pause. The mission had medical texts. Brother Callum believed that knowledge should not be kept from people based on who they were. "He let me read everything he had." "He's a good man." "He is. Silence the kind that is settled into its own shape." "Your father's people," he said carefully. She looked up then, straight at him. "The Chiricahua Apache," she said. "My father was a leader of our band." Another pause, this one slightly different in quality. "He died in 1873. Our village was burned, those who survived scattered." She looked back at her work. "I have been finding ways to survive since then." He did not say he was sorry this time. He sensed that this particular fact was not looking for an apology. It was simply something she had put on the table between them, like one of her cloth pouches, and she was waiting to see what he would do with it. "My wife died in 1874, he said. "February. She took a fever and I couldn't get a doctor in time." He looked at the coffee in his cup. She was 29 years old. The lamplight moved. "That's why you wrote to Brother Callum," she said. It was not a question. "That's part of it," he said. "I'm practical enough to know I needed medical help on this land. But yes, that's part of it." She returned to her work, and he drank his coffee, and outside the night sounds of the ranch moved around the house. Horses in the corral, a wind that had come down off the mountains carrying the smell of pine and cold, and neither of them said anything more for a long time. But something had been established, something that had no name yet. It was 4 days later that Saya saw Lieutenant Warren Bletch. She was crossing the main street of Redstone on an errand Colt had come with her, this time walking alongside, without making it obvious that he was there specifically to prevent a repeat of what had happened at Voss's store when she stopped in the middle of the street and went very still. He was across the road near the entrance of the hotel. A military man in his mid-40s, tall with the posture of someone who had spent decades in uniform. She knew the posture before she knew the face, and she knew the face before he turned enough for her to be certain. Warren Bletch, Lieutenant Warren Bletch, who had come to their village in the autumn of 1872 with assurances from the Army and a letter from the territorial government promising that the Chiricahua band under her father's leadership would be left in peace on their traditional land. Who had shaken her father's hand? Who had eaten at their fire? Who had stayed 2 days and spoken about the future with the confident authority of a man who believed or appeared to believe in the promises he was making? Who had left? And who had not been seen again when 6 months later the soldiers came? She made herself move again, made herself walk normally. Colt noticed the pause. She knew he noticed it because she was beginning to understand that he noticed most things despite the deliberate stillness he cultivated. But he did not ask. Not yet. She watched Bletch across the street without appearing to watch him. He was speaking to someone. He had his back half turned, and she tracked the direction of his conversation, followed the angle of his attention, and then saw who he was speaking to. Edmund Voss. They were standing very close together for men who appeared to be conducting casual business. Voss had a paper in his hand folded once, and he was pointing at something on it. Bletch was nodding in a way that communicated not agreement exactly, but confirmation, the nod of a man being shown something he already knew. Saya filed this. She filed it with the careful, unemotional thoroughness with which she filed everything that could not yet be acted upon. The patience required for this kind of filing was a skill she had built out of necessity in the years since 1873, when she had learned that survival often depended not on what you did immediately, but on what you waited to understand completely. She thought about the paper in Voss's hand. She thought about the land surveys she had noticed writing out with Colt the previous week, the survey stakes driven into the earth at intervals that had no agricultural logic. She thought about what Brother Callum had told her before she left the mission, not about Colt, but about the territory, about the railroad that was being planned, about the land values that would change overnight when the route was announced. She thought about her father's land. She thought about the fire. She thought about a lieutenant who had shaken her father's hand. And she understood with the sudden clarity of a thing that has been half known for a long time and then becomes fully known in a single moment, that she was standing in the middle of a story that had started in 1872 and had not ended, that it was still going, that the same machinery that had destroyed her village was still turning here in this valley against different people now, but with the same logic that land is worth more without the people already living on it. She made a decision. It was not a dramatic decision. It did not feel like the kind of decision that would be recognized from the outside as significant. It felt like a settling of weight, like something shifting from one position to a more sustainable one. She would not leave Broken Spur at the end of her contracted period. She would stay. Not because she had nowhere else to go. The days when she had nowhere to go were behind her. She had skills now, she had reputation building, she had options that she had earned through years of relentless preparation. She would stay because she was standing at the center of something that she understood better than anyone in this valley. And because understanding a thing completely and then walking away from it was a different kind of defeat than the one she had already survived. She would stay because Colt Hargrove had stood on that platform and made his choice without hesitating, and some part of her had been watching for a man who would do exactly that for a very long time. She would stay. She turned away from Voss and Bletch before either of them could register her attention. Colt was 2 steps behind her, steady and unhurried in his boots. "Ready?" he said. "Yes," she said. They walked back through Redstone together, past the closed door of Voss's store and the sheriff's office, where Tatum Crill's silhouette was visible through the window, past the church, and the boarding house and the small knot of women who stopped their conversation to watch Saya pass with the practiced invisibility of people who believe they are being subtle. Saya walked with her spine straight and her satchel over her shoulder and her eyes forward. She was not escaping this town. She was learning it, and she was going to be here long enough to use what she learned. The wagon was at the livery, and when they reached it, Colt helped her up onto the bench with a brief impersonal steadiness of hand and climbed up beside her and gathered the reins. The horses leaned into the traces and the wagon rolled out of Redstone and onto the northern road. The mountains were visible ahead, their peaks still carrying snow, even in April white against the sky that had turned the particular deep blue of late afternoon in the high country. Saya looked at them. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Not today, but stay. So not done." He did not ask what. He understood in the way that men who have been doing hard things for a long time sometimes understand that the right response to this particular statement was patience. "Whenever you're ready," he said. The wagon moved north. The ranch came into view over the last rise. And behind them in the town of Redstone, a man named Tatum Creel watched from the window of his office as the dust settled on the northern road, and his expression had the quality of someone doing arithmetic about a problem that is becoming more complicated than he had initially planned for. He turned back to his desk, he picked up a pen, and he began to write a letter to Edmund Voss. The trouble with Emmett Dre's wound was not the wound itself, it was the silence around it. He had come back from the eastern pasture on a Thursday evening in late May, with his left arm wrapped in a cloth that had started out white and was no longer anything close to it, and he had sat down at the bunkhouse table and told Dutch Garner that he had caught himself on a piece of broken fence wire, which was a thing that happened on ranches and required attention but not alarm. Dutch had cleaned it and wrapped it and told him to rest the arm for 2 days, and Emmett had nodded and eaten his supper and gone to sleep. 4 days later, the arm was wrong. Saya noticed it before anyone else did because she had trained herself to look at people the way a tracker looks at ground. Not for what is obvious, but for what has been adjusted, compensated for hidden. Emmett Dre was a man who moved with a particular physical confidence, the confidence of someone who trusted his body to perform what he asked of it without negotiation. On the morning of the fifth M after his injury, he was moving differently. Small things. The angle of his right shoulder carrying slightly more load than usual. The way he positioned himself at the breakfast table to keep his left arm below the line of casual attention. She said nothing at breakfast. After the men had gone to their morning work, she went to Dutch. The wound on Emmett's arm, she said. When did he say it happened? Dutch told her. Have you looked at it since you dressed it? Dutch's expression answered the question before he spoke it. She found Emmett in the barn working one-handed on a piece of tack, with the focused determination of a man trying to prove something to himself. She stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him compensate for what the left arm could no longer do without pain. Let me see the arm, she said. It's fine. Let me see it. He looked at her over his shoulder with the particular resistance of a man who has decided that showing weakness is more dangerous than the weakness itself. She waited. She had learned that waiting was often more persuasive than an argument. He put down the tack. He turned. He unwrapped the cloth himself slowly, and what was underneath it made Saya's jaw tighten once before she schooled her expression back into the careful neutrality of someone who cannot afford to transmit alarm to the person they are trying to help. The infection had gone deep. The edges of the wound had turned the color and texture of something that had been trying to close but had been prevented from doing so by contamination she could see was already moving in the wrong direction. The red lines beginning at the wound's edge were faint, but they were there, and she knew what they meant and where they were going if nothing stopped them. How long has it felt like this? She asked. Few days. Why didn't you come to me? He looked away, figured it would sort itself. She looked at the arm for another moment. It won't, she said. Not anymore. She went to Colt. She told him what she had found and what needed to be done, and she watched his face process this the way she had come to expect it to, without theater, without the dramatic displays of concern that some men used to substitute for actual response. He listened completely, and then he asked one question. What do you need? She told him. He sent a man for water and fire. He sent Dutch for the whiskey they kept for emergencies, of which there had been 2 in the past year, and this was now the 3rd. He cleared the kitchen table himself, pushing everything to the side with a thoroughness that suggested he understood the room needed to become something different for the next few hours. Emmett Dre sat in the chair that Colt placed in the center of the cleared space and looked at the wall opposite him with the expression of a man preparing himself for something he could not think his way around. He was 35 years old and he had been hurt before, and he had dealt with it the way hard men in hard country dealt with physical pain, which was to go quiet and endure. But there was a difference between pain you could outlast and damage you could not. And some part of him understood now that he had been on the wrong side of that line for several days. Saya prepared her instruments. She worked with the systematic calm she had built over years of doing this kind of work, in conditions that offered no margin for hesitation, laying out what she had brought from her satchel, alongside what the ranch could provide, assessing the combination with the clear-eyed practicality of someone who has learned to be an excellent craftsman with imperfect tools. She had her Apache remedies. The compounds her father's healers had used refined over generations that she had memorized and carried and practiced in the years since the village burn. She had her knowledge from Brother Callum's medical texts, the anatomy and the surgical principles, and the understanding of infection that the Western doctors had built through their own methods. She had learned over time to use both without loyalty to either, because what mattered was what worked, and what worked was usually everything applied at once in the right order. Colt positioned himself at Emmett's shoulders. Dutch took the legs. The other hands had been sent outside, not because Saya asked for this, but because Colt understood it without being asked, which was something she was adding to the account she kept privately of the man she worked for. She told Emmett clearly and without softening what was going to happen and approximately how much it was going to cost him. She had found that people did better when they were told the truth in advance. It gave them somewhere to put their will. Emmett looked at her once directly and said, "Do it." What followed was not easy for anyone in that room. She worked with the focus she brought to all skilled work, the focus that narrows the world to the immediate task and shuts out everything outside it. She had learned this narrowing as a survival skill, the ability to be completely in the work and nowhere else. Her hands were steady. They had always been steady under pressure, which was a quality she had inherited from her father, who had been the calmest man she had ever known in the moments that demanded it most. Colt held Emmett still with a strength that was careful and precise, not brutal. She registered this without looking up from what she was doing. The hands of a man who understood that the goal was control, not punishment. When it was finished, and Emmett had gone to the place beyond consciousness that the body sometimes chooses as a mercy, she sat back and looked at what she had done with the dispassionate assessment of someone checking their own work. Clean. The infection had been addressed. The wound was properly dressed with the compound she had prepared, and if there was no further contamination, and if she was right about the progress, Emmett Dre would have full use of his arm. Dutch's voice from across the room. Is he going to be all right? He will be, she said. She heard the exhale that moved through the room, at that the invisible relaxation of breath that people hold without knowing they are holding it when someone they know is in danger. She cleaned her instruments. She washed her hands at the pump, scrubbing with the thorough attention she always gave this, and when she turned from the sink, Colt was standing near the table watching her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. She had cataloged most of his expressions by this point. The working face closed and functional, the rare amusement dry and brief, the controlled anger that appeared when Voss or Creel entered the conversation, the grief that moved behind everything else like a current beneath ice. This was different. She could not immediately name it. That was something to see, he said. His voice was rough at the edges in a way it wasn't usually. It was necessary work, she said. I know it was. He paused. You never looked uncertain. I was uncertain. Couldn't tell. She looked at him. Uncertainty is not the same as incompetence. I have learned to be uncertain and continue anyway. He was quiet for a moment. My wife, he said, and then stopped. She waited. When Sarah got the fever, he said, I sat next to her bed for 2 days while she got worse and I had nothing. No knowledge. No tools. Nothing I could do with my hands that would make any difference. I just sat there and watched. He looked at the table at the place where Emmett had been. I have never felt so useless in my entire life. She understood that he was not telling her this to receive comfort. He was telling her because the morning had opened something that had been kept closed for a long time, and the pressure of it needed somewhere to go. My father died the same way, she said, not from fever, but from the same thing, the absence of what could have saved him. There were things I knew even then, things I could have done, but I did not have what I needed. The land was already gone. The medicines I would have needed were not available to us anymore. She looked at the wall. I have spent 6 years making sure I am never without what I need again. The silence between them was different from earlier silences. It had more weight, more honesty. That's why you learned everything you could, he said. Yes, both kinds. Knowledge does not belong to one people, she said. It belongs to whoever is willing to learn it. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he moved to the stove and refilled his coffee cup and refilled hers without asking and set it in front of her, and they stood in the kitchen that had become a surgery and was now becoming a kitchen again, and drank their coffee while the morning light moved through the window, and Emmett Dre slept in the next room with a sound arm and a better chance than he'd had an hour ago. It was 3 weeks later that Saya found the tracks. She had been following the eastern fence line on horseback, doing the survey of the ranch's boundaries that Colt had asked her to do as part of her growing role in the ranch's operation. He had discovered gradually, and without making any announcement about it, that her observational skills extended well beyond medicine, and he had begun finding small ways to use them. She had not objected. The more of the land she understood, the better. She had a good eye for ground. This was another thing inherited from her father's people, refined by years of traveling alone across country, where reading the land was not a skill but a requirement for continued existence. She read the terrain as she rode, noting what was usual and what was not, cataloging disturbances and patterns the way she cataloged everything. The cattle tracks were not unusual. What was unusual was where they went. A herd does not voluntarily move in a single coordinated direction across broken ground at night. Cattle disturbed by predators scatter. Cattle driven by experienced riders move in a specific pattern that leaves specific evidence, and that evidence, once you knew what to look for, was as legible as print. She followed it for 2 miles past the eastern fence line, and into the rougher country beyond where the ground hardened and the tracks became more difficult, and then deliberately confused the way tracks become when the people making them understand that someone might follow. She stopped on a rise and looked at the country ahead. In the distance, perhaps a mile further east, there was a line of fence she did not recognize, new posts not yet weathered. And beyond that fence, barely visible at this distance, the roofline of a building that was not on any map of Broken Spur's neighboring properties that she had seen. She pulled her horse around and rode back. She did not go to Colt directly. She went to the bunkhouse at the end of the day when the men were washing up before supper, and she moved through the ordinary activity of it, observing without appearing to filing what she saw. Emmett Dre was at the water basin, his newly healed arm working well, the muscle memory returning. He was talking to one of the younger hands, a boy named Prescott, who had been with the ranch for 6 months. The conversation was easy and unremarkable. But Emmett's eyes moved to the window when Dutch came in, and there was a quality to that glance that Saya had learned to recognize over years of watching people in situations where what they showed and what they felt were two different things. He was checking. He was making sure of something. She thought about the tracks. She thought about the route they had taken, the specific fence they had crossed, the specific building she had seen in the distance. She thought about who would have known that the eastern pasture held a concentration of Broken Spur's herd over the past weeks. She thought about who had access to the ranch's schedule and the patrol patterns of its men. She thought about the infection in Emmett's arm and the 4 days he had let it go without coming to her, and whether a man in significant pain who delays seeking help might be a man who is avoiding scrutiny during those particular days for reasons unrelated to pride. She did not go to Colt that night. She needed to be certain. Over the next week, she watched. She was good at this. She had been doing it since she was a child, watching from the edge of camp, while the adults made decisions, watching from the tree line, while soldiers moved through country her father's people had held for generations. The ability to be present without registering as present was a skill that had saved her life more than once and had informed her medical work in ways that were harder to articulate but no less real. She arranged through the small adjustments available to someone who managed the ranch's daily information flow for certain pieces of information to reach Emmett and not others. She mentioned in passing at breakfast one morning that Colt was planning to move the herd from the southern pasture to the eastern one at the end of the week. She watched Emmett absorb this with the casual attention of someone hearing ordinary ranch news. That evening, she stayed awake past the point when the bunkhouse lights went out. At 10:30, she heard a horse leave the small corral near the bunkhouse, moving quietly, moving with the deliberate quiet of someone who understood that quiet was necessary. She watched from her window as Emmett Dre rode east. In the morning, she went to Colt. A man who has given his trust and had it used against him is not comforted by the explanation. "What do you want to do?" she asked. He looked up. "Not yet," he said. "Not until we know the full shape of what Voss is doing. If Emmett knows he's been discovered, we lose our only window into what Voss is planning." He paused. "Can you manage what you know without showing it?" She looked at him steadily. "I have been managing what I know without showing it for 6 years," she said. "Yes." Something moved in his expression that was not quite a smile, but was in the same territory. "I know," he said. "I shouldn't have asked." She let him have that, which was its own form of grace. They moved through the following days with the careful performance of a ranch that did not know it was being watched, which required both of them to be something they were not in front of a man who was reporting everything he saw to Edmund Voss. It was, Saya reflected during those days, an interesting kind of discipline. Not deception exactly, but a controlled withholding, the same skill she used in medicine when a patient needed to not fully understand the severity of their situation in order to survive it. It was on a Friday night in early July that the attack came. She was in her room when she heard the first shot, and she was at her window before the echo of it finished moving across the valley. In the yard below, she could see the orange pulse of fire already taking hold in the structure nearest the main barn, the small equipment shed that held tools and hay, and everything that burns quickly when it has a reason to. More shots, 3 in rapid succession from the dark ground north of the corral. Then shouting Dutch's voice and Colt's organizing, directing, pulling the ranch's defense into shape from the chaos that the attackers had intended. She pulled on her boots. She did not go to the main house. She took the leather case from beneath her bed, the one that held the bow she had carried since before the village burned, the bow that had belonged to her father's best hunter, and that she had taken the night everything ended because it was the most useful thing she could carry, and because leaving it behind felt like leaving something of her father behind too. She had maintained it with the same care she gave her medical instruments. It was ready. She went out her door and into the yard. The fire was building. The attackers were positioned along the northern tree line, using the darkness and the confusion of the fire as cover. She could see the orange sparks of their muzzle flashes in the dark, irregular, moving. They were not standing still. They were advancing in short bursts toward the main house. Colt was at the corner of the barn with Dutch, both of them returning fire toward the tree line. She could hear him calling to the other hands, positioning them. He was good in a crisis. She had already known this, but watching it confirmed it. The same settled authority he brought to ordinary ranch decisions, present and functional under fire. She moved to the far side of the burning shed. The roof of the main storage building, the one adjacent to the shed not yet burning, was accessible from the back by way of a water barrel and a ledge that she had noted weeks ago during her systematic assessment of the ranch's physical layout. She had noted it the way she noted everything without particular purpose at the time, in the understanding that information stored carefully tends to find its use eventually. She climbed. The roof gave her height and angle. From above, the geometry of the attack became visible in a way it was not from the ground. The positions of the attackers, the direction of their advance, the torches two of them were carrying toward the main house. She had lit torches like that herself as a child during ceremonies. She knew how they moved. She drew the bow. The first shot extinguished the leading torch in a way that made no sound except the arrow and the darkness that followed it. The man carrying it stopped confused and then stumbled when his horse spooked from the shock of the impact on the wood of the torch handle. The second shot found the second torch with enough force to send it spinning to the ground, where it guttered against the dirt. The advance on the main house stopped. She knocked a third arrow and waited. Below her, she heard the shooting from the tree line decrease as the attackers recalculated. Two torches gone in the dark from an angle they could not locate. The fire in the equipment shed was the only light, and it was behind her, making her position on the roof invisible against the dark sky. She heard one of them call to the others. She could not make out the words. Then the shooting stopped. The tree line sounds changed, horses moving, men moving, the specific noise of a group that has decided the arithmetic has changed. They were leaving. She stayed on the roof until she was certain. When she climbed down, Colt was standing in the yard looking up at where she had been, and his face in the firelight had the expression she had been unable to name in the kitchen after Emmett's surgery. She could name it now. It was the face of a man who has been surprised by something he realizes he should have expected. A man encountering something that exceeds the category he had prepared for it. He looked at the roof. He looked at her. He looked at the bow in her hand. "How long were you up there?" he said. "Long enough." "Did you see who they were?" "Not clearly, but I have something." She reached into her pocket and produced what she had found on the ground near the base of the water barrel, half hidden in the dirt where one of the attackers had stood before the shooting started. She had spotted it when she climbed down a small object catching the edge of the firelight. She held it out. It was a military insignia pin, small brass, the kind that attached to a uniform collar, the kind that was standard issue to a specific unit designation. Colt took it. He looked at it carefully in the firelight. He turned it over. She watched his face and said nothing. "This is Army issue," he said. "Yes." "From a specific unit?" "Yes." He looked up at her. She had been waiting for this moment for 3 months. She had been carrying what she knew the full weight of it through every day at Broken Spur, through the kitchen conversations, and the medical work, and the long rides checking fence line, and the evenings on the porch, watching the light change on the mountains. She had carried it with the same careful discipline she applied to everything, waiting until she was certain, waiting until she understood the complete shape of what she was dealing with. "Tatum Creel," she said. "His unit, before he became sheriff." She paused. "It is the same unit that came to my father's village in the spring of 1873. Colt went very still. She continued, her voice steady and deliberate, the voice she used when delivering a diagnosis, the facts in the correct order, without embellishment or emotion, because the facts themselves were sufficient. "He came with soldiers. They had orders, or they claimed they had orders. My father cooperated completely. He had cooperated for 2 years with every government representative who had come to us. He believed that cooperation was the path to continued peace. She looked at the insignia in Colt's hand. In April of 1873, the soldiers came back without orders and without announcement. They burned everything. The fire in the equipment shed had begun to diminish. Around them, the ranch was settling back into itself, the hands moving through the aftermath with the grim efficiency of people doing necessary work. The night sounds of the valley were returning hesitant to the spaces the gunfire had emptied. Creel was there, she said. You're certain? I have my father's account, written. He kept records of every government representative who came to our land, every name, every date, every promise made. She looked at the insignia. He believed that written records would protect us. A pause. They did not protect us, but they survived. Colt closed his fingers around the insignia. Voss needed the land, he said slowly, working through it. The railroad. If the route goes through this valley, then the land along it is worth a great deal more than it appears to be worth now, she said. Voss has been buying it. The ranchers who could be squeezed out through debt and inflated prices. The Apache land that could be cleared through other means. She let that settle. Creel was his tool then. He is still his tool now. Bletchlin, Colt said, the lieutenant you saw with Voss. He sold my father's location and the Army's patrol schedule to whoever Voss used at the time. He gave them what they needed to do it without interference. She held his gaze. He is here now because the railroad decision is coming soon. He is here to confirm the land positions before the announcement. Voss needs to know what he owns before it becomes public. Colt was quiet for a long moment. The last of the equipment shed fire subsided into orange coals. How long have you known this? He said. It was not an accusation. It was a man asking a genuine question about the woman who had been working alongside him for 3 months. The shape of it since the day I saw Bletch with Voss, she said. The confirmation tonight. You carried it this whole time. I had to be certain before I brought you into it, she said. And I had to understand what I was asking you to be part of. This is not a simple dispute about cattle prices or land surveys. If I bring you into this, I bring you into everything I am carrying. She met his eyes directly. I needed to know that you could hold the weight of it. He looked at her. The question in his face was not whether he could hold the weight. She could see that he understood what she was saying, that she had been watching him for 3 months, with the same careful assessment she brought to everything, and that this moment was the result of what she had found. He held out the insignia pin to her. Show me your father's records, he said, all of them. She took the pin back. And for the first time since she had stepped off the train at Redstone in the ash-smelling yard of a ranch that had just been attacked and not broken, Saya allowed herself to feel the precise quality of relief that comes not from safety, but from not being alone in something you have been carrying alone for a very long time. Dutch appeared from the direction of the bunkhouse. Building's gone, he said, meaning the equipment shed. House is intact, bunkhouse is intact, barn is intact. He looked between Colt and Saya. Emmett is gone, horse and saddlebag. Looks like he left sometime during the fighting. Colt received this without visible surprise. I know, he said. Dutch looked at him. In the morning, Colt said. We'll talk about all of it in the morning. Right now, get the men settled and double the watch. Dutch nodded and turned back. Colt looked at the place where the equipment shed had stood, now a skeleton of blackened timber and fading heat, and then at the mountains visible in the dark distance, their peaks carrying the faint silver of a half-moon. They burned what they could, he said, and they didn't get what they came for. No, Saya said, they did not. They'll come back. Yes. He turned to look at her, this man who had stood on a train platform in April and made a choice without hesitating, who had cleared a table for emergency surgery and held a man still through it, who had drunk coffee with her in the pre-dawn quiet and told her the truth about his grief without asking for anything in return. Then we'd better be ready, he said. The morning after the attack, Dutch Garner asked everyone to sit down. This was unusual enough that they all did it without question. The remaining hands, Prescott and 2 others, minus Emmett Dre, who had ridden out in the dark and not come back, settled around the long kitchen table with the particular silence of men who had been through something the night before and were still carrying the weight of it in their bodies. Colt sat at the head. Saya stood near the stove. Dutch reached into his coat and placed a leather satchel on the table. It was not large. It was the kind of satchel a man carries without attracting attention, the kind that could be mistaken for personal effects, or tools, or a dozen other ordinary things. He had been carrying it, Saya would later learn, for 7 months. "I've been doing some collecting," Dutch said. He opened the satchel and began placing items on the table one by one, with the careful deliberateness of a man who has rehearsed this moment many times and is now finally performing it for the right audience. Land contracts. Signed and countersigned, the ink professional and precise, establishing purchase agreements between Edmund Voss and a series of names that were not Edmund Voss, but were Edmund Voss shell designations. Business entities, the paper architecture of a man who understood that distance between himself and his actions was itself a form of protection. Dutch had obtained these through a contact at the county land office in Crestfield, a clerk who had been watching the same pattern Dutch was watching, and had reached out through channels that were quiet and slow and exactly right. Cattle ledgers, receipts from a livestock buyer operating out of a town 40 miles north, showing purchases of animals bearing Broken Spurs brand alongside two other brands from ranches in the valley. The dates corresponded precisely to the nights when Colt's herd had been hit. A letter, not from Voss. From Lieutenant Warren Bletch to a land acquisition firm in Denver dated 8 months earlier, describing the likely route of the railroad survey in terms that were specific enough to have come from inside the planning process and referencing certain parcels of Apache-occupied land as already resolved, a phrase whose meaning Saya read without needing it explained to her. Colt looked at the items on the table. He looked at Dutch. 7 months, he said. Started noticing things about a year ago, Dutch said. The survey stakes on the east boundary. The way Voss reacted every time you mentioned ordering from Denver. The pattern of the cattle losses too clean for random thieves, too specific for a coincidence. He paused. I didn't say anything until I had enough to mean something. Figured one piece isn't a case, but all of it together is a case, Saya said. Dutch looked at her. He had been looking at her differently since the night she had climbed the roof, though he had not said anything about it directly. The change was in the quality of his attention, not more respectful exactly because he had been respectful from the beginning, but more precise, like a man recalibrating a measurement he thought he already understood. There's one more thing, Dutch said. He reached into the satchel and produced a folded document with a different character than the others. Older. The paper was heavier, the kind used for official correspondence a decade ago. Army records, he said, from the Territorial Archive in Denver. I wrote to a man I knew there, a clerk who's been in that office longer than anyone and remembers more than he's supposed to. He slid it across the table toward Saya. It's the deployment record for Creel's unit, spring of 1873. She unfolded it. She read it once completely, without expression. Then she folded it again and held it in both hands for a moment, looking at the table. He commanded the unit personally, she said. Yes. The date matches. Yes. The kitchen was very quiet. She set the document down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the table. This small, precise gesture was the only outward evidence of everything moving through her at that moment, the years of carrying what she knew without proof, the years of building towards something she could not yet see but refused to stop moving toward. The evidence was in front of her now. It was real. It was enough. She looked at Colt. He was watching her with the expression that she had named finally on the night of the attack. The expression of a man encountering something that exceeds the category he prepared for it. He had been wearing it more often in recent weeks, and she had stopped trying to determine whether this unsettled him or whether it was something else entirely. We need to go to the circuit court, she said, before Voss learns that we have this. Colt looked at the items on the table. He looked at Dutch. How fast can he move? He asked. Voss fast when he needs to. Dutch's voice was careful. He's got money in Denver. He's got lawyers. If he hears that someone's collecting against him before we get to the judge, then we don't wait, Colt said. He stood. Get the wagon ready, he said to Prescott. Dutch, you're coming with us. I want a witness to every piece of this who can stand up in court and say where it came from and how he got it. He looked at Saya. There's something else, she said. She went to her room. She returned carrying a small book bound in leather that had been repaired twice with cord, its pages swollen with age, and the particular weight of handwriting that has been pressed into paper with deliberate force. She set it on the table beside Dutch's evidence. My father kept this from 1870 until the spring of 1873, she said. He recorded every contact with the army, the territorial government, the land surveyors. Every name, every date, every promise. She placed her hand flat on the cover for a moment briefly, the way you touch something that belongs to a person who is gone. Tatum Creel's name appears 3 times. The last entry is 4 days before the village burned. Nobody spoke. He believed that documentation would protect his people, she said. He was not wrong about the value of records. He was wrong about whether the people reading them would care. She looked at the assembled evidence on the table. They will care now. Colt put on his coat. They arrived in Redstone late that afternoon and went directly to the telegraph office where Colt sent 2 messages, one to the circuit court office in Crestfield, requesting an emergency hearing, and one to a lawyer in Denver named Aldous Prentice, who was the kind of man who had built his reputation specifically by being the person that other lawyers preferred not to face. Voss learned they were in town. Of course he did. Redstone was not large enough for significant arrivals to go unregistered, and Colt Hargrove walking into the telegraph office with his foreman and his Apache healer and a leather satchel was significant by any measure. Creel came to find them at the hotel where they had taken 2 rooms for the night. He stood in the doorway of the small lobby with his hand near his holster in the familiar way, and he looked at Colt with the expression of a man who is trying to determine how much the other man knows. Heard you had some trouble out at the Broken Spur last night, Creel said. You heard right, Colt said. Drifters, probably. Moving through the territory. Creel's voice had the practiced flatness of a man delivering a prepared conclusion. Hard to track that kind. Probably long gone by now. Probably, Colt agreed. Creel's eyes moved to Saya, who was standing near the window with her satchel and the same still attention she brought to everything. Whatever he was looking for in her face, he did not find it. I'd suggest, Creel said, that you keep your situation to yourself for the time being. These things have a way of getting complicated when too many people are involved. I appreciate the advice, Colt said. Creel looked at him for a moment longer, doing the arithmetic behind his eyes, and then he left. Dutch let out a slow breath. He knows something's changed, Dutch said. He knows we're still standing, Colt said. That's enough to worry him. He looked at Saya. Tomorrow, she said. It was not a question. Tomorrow, he confirmed. She went to her room. She sat on the edge of the bed in the small hotel room with her father's journal in her hands, and she did not open it. She had read it so many times that she no longer needed to read it. She knew every entry, every name, every date, the careful, precise script of a man who had believed that truth recorded was truth preserved. She thought about him. She did this rarely deliberately because grief is a resource like any other and must be managed rather than indulged. But tonight she allowed it. She sat with the weight of who he had been, the patience of him, the steadiness, the particular quality of courage that is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act correctly despite it. She had inherited this from him. It was the most useful thing he had left her. She thought about what tomorrow meant. Not just the legal outcome, though that mattered, but what it meant to carry something for 6 years through survival and solitude, and the long rebuilding of a life from almost nothing, and to arrive finally at the moment when the carrying becomes action. She thought about Colt Hargrove standing on a train platform in April, reading a letter and making a choice. She slept. The circuit court convened in Redstone's town hall 3 days after Colt's telegraph, the circuit judge having agreed to an emergency session based on the preliminary summary of evidence that Aldous Prentice had transmitted from Denver. Prentice himself arrived on the morning train, a compact and unhurried man in his 50s with the particular confidence of someone who has spent decades being underestimated and has found this professionally useful. He reviewed the evidence for 2 hours the night before the hearing. When he finished, he looked at Saya. The journal, he said. You're prepared to present it. Yes, in open court. There will be people in that room who will not want to hear what it says. She looked at him steadily. I have been prepared to present it for 6 years, she said. I was waiting for a room that would listen. Prentice regarded her for a moment with the assessing attention of a man evaluating the quality of a resource. Then he nodded once and returned to his notes. The town hall filled. This was the nature of a frontier town with a grievance that had been building for years. When the moment arrived for the grievance to find official form, people came. Ranchers who had been paying Voss's inflated prices for a decade came. Farmers who had watched neighbors squeezed out of their land came. Ordinary people who had known for years that something was wrong and had lacked the mechanism to address it came filing into the wooden benches with the quiet purposefulness of people who understand they are present at something that matters. Edmund Voss arrived with two lawyers from Denver, well-dressed men who moved through the room with the deliberate visibility of people whose presence is itself a message. Mildred Voss sat behind her brother with her hands folded, and her expression, the practiced blankness of someone who has decided in advance that whatever happens is someone else's fault. Tatum Creel sat in the front row in his sheriff's uniform, his face arranged into official composure. Emmett Dre was not in the room. He was in the county jail in Crestfield, where he had been since 2 days after the attack, apprehended by a deputy marshal who had been quietly briefed by Aldous Prentice before the hearing was announced. This was Prentice's doing the careful sequencing of events that ensured the right information arrived in the right order, which was the particular skill that had built his reputation. The circuit judge was a man named Harlan Sowell, 60 years old, with the appearance of someone who has presided over enough frontier justice to have lost his patience for theater while retaining his respect for evidence. He called the room to order with a single strike of his gavel, looked at both tables of attorneys, and said that he intended to hear the facts and nothing surrounding the facts, and that anyone who confused the two would be removed. Prentice presented the land contracts first. He walked through them with the methodical clarity of a man building a structure. Each document a piece, each piece connecting to the next, the pattern emerging as the pieces accumulated, the shell companies resolving back to Voss. The timing of land acquisitions correlating precisely with the dates when specific ranchers had been subjected to sudden price increases and called in debts. The railroad survey route obtained through a contact at the Territorial Planning Office, overlaid against Voss's acquisitions like a map over another map, the correspondence too precise to be coincidence. Voss's lawyers objected. Judge Sowell sustained some objections and overruled others with the same economy he brought to everything, and the structure continued to build. The cattle ledgers. The livestock buyer testifying by written deposition from his town 40 miles north, identifying the brands and the dates and the men who had brought the animals to him. The Broken Spur brand. Two other Valley brands, a pattern of sales that matched the pattern of losses the ranchers had been reporting for 2 years. Voss sat at his table with the controlled stillness of a man who is managing his exposure, carefully adjusting his posture when the objections succeeded and returning to stillness when they did not. He was watching Prentice the way a chess player watches the board, not the pieces, but the strategy revealing itself through the movement of pieces. Then Prentice turned to Dutch Garner. Dutch testified with the unhurried plainness of a man who has been working the land his entire life and has no gift for embellishment and no need for it. He described what he had observed. He described how he had collected what he collected and through whom. He described the 7 months of patient assembly, the decision to wait until the evidence was complete, rather than act on pieces of it, the reason he had chosen to wait for the right moment and the right person to stand beside. He did not look at Voss when he spoke. He looked at Judge Sowell because Dutch Garner was a man who understood instinctively that you address the person who has the authority to act on what you are saying. When Dutch was finished, Voss's lead attorney rose. He was skilled. Say watched him work with the same assessing attention she brought to everything, tracking the structure of his approach, the way he was trying to construct an alternative account of the evidence, not denying the documents but questioning their provenance, suggesting the possibility of fabrication, positioning Voss as the target of a coordinated effort by competing interests to undermine legitimate business practice. He was building toward the question of motive. He was going to argue that Colt Hargrove had reasons to want Voss discredited and that Saya's presence in the case represented something that reasonable people might question. He began to move in that direction. Colt stood up. He was not called. He had not been scheduled to speak at this point. Judge Sowell looked at him with the expression of a man who is determining whether to be annoyed. "Mr. Hargrove," Sowell said, "Your Honor." Colt said, "I understand I'm out of order. I'll accept whatever consequence you decide is appropriate." He looked at the room, at the ranchers and the benches, the farmers, the ordinary people who had filed in because they understood something was happening that affected them. But I need to say something before counsel continues, because what he's building toward is an argument about motive and credibility, and specifically about Miss Saya's involvement in this case. Sowell studied him. Voss's attorney said, "Your Honor." "Sit down," Sowell said. He looked at Colt. "You have 2 minutes, Mr. Hargrove. Use them precisely." Colt turned to face the room. "This woman came to my ranch in April as a healer," he said. "She came because I wrote to a mission asking for help, and she was the person with the skill and the willingness to provide it. She has saved the arm of one of my hands and the leg of a neighboring rancher, and treated every person in this valley who asked for her help without distinction or condition." He paused. "She has also spent 6 years carrying documented evidence of crimes committed against her father's people by some of the same men now sitting at that table. She carried it because she was building toward a moment when someone would listen. She stayed on my ranch because she understood that what was done to her people and what is being done to this valley comes from the same source and the same logic." The room was very quiet. "She did not stay because she had nowhere else to go," Colt said. "She stayed because this valley needed what she knew, and because she is the kind of person who does not walk away from a need she can address." He looked at Voss's attorney. "Whatever argument you are constructing about her motivations, I suggest you consider that the simplest explanation for why she is here is that she is telling the truth. And in my experience, that is usually the most accurate one." He sat down. Judge Sowell looked at the attorney. The attorney, with the recalibrating expression of a man who has just watched his prepared approach become substantially less useful, sat down. Prentice called Saya. She walked to the front of the room with the same unhurried precision with which she did everything, and she stood before Judge Sowell, and she was sworn in, and she looked at the room full of people, some of whom had whispered about her in the street, some of whom she had treated for injuries and fevers and the ordinary disasters of frontier life, some of whom she had never seen before, with the same composed attention she had given Tatum Creel on the train platform in April. She presented her father's journal. Prentice walked her through it methodically, each entry, each name, each date. She translated the sections written in her father's language and read aloud the sections he had written in English, which were careful and precise, and carried the particular weight of a man writing for a record he believed would outlast him. It had, by 6 years and counting. Creel's name appeared the first time in an entry from November 1872, recording a meeting at which promises were made about land boundaries and Army non-interference. It appeared the second time in February 1873, when Creel had returned with updated assurances and a letter bearing a territorial seal. It appeared the third time 4 days before the end of April 1873, when her father had written, "Lieutenant Creel came again today. He stayed for the midday meal. He spoke about the future with great confidence. I believe he is lying. I do not yet understand why." The room absorbed this. Creel in the front row had gone very still. Prentice produced the Army deployment record Dutch had obtained. He presented it alongside the journal entry. The same unit, the same commanding officer, the same dates. Then Aldous Prentice did the thing he had been building toward for 2 days. He called Emmett Dre. Emmett came in from the side door accompanied by a deputy marshal. He looked different from the man Saya had known at Broken Spur, not smaller exactly, but reduced the way a fire reduces to its actual size when the wind stops feeding it. He sat in the witness chair and looked at his hands for a moment. Then he looked up. He spoke for 20 minutes. He spoke about the arrangement he had made with Voss 3 years ago, which had seemed at the time like a small thing, reporting the ranch's schedule, the patrol patterns, the herd movements, in exchange for a debt cancellation that had felt impossible to achieve any other way. He spoke about how the small thing had grown, how the cattle thefts had escalated, how he had been present at the planning of the attack on Broken Spur without understanding until that night exactly what he had agreed to be part of. He looked at Saya once while he spoke. She gave him nothing, not forgiveness, not condemnation, just the same steady attention she gave everything, which was perhaps its own form of acknowledgement. He described a meeting between Voss and Creel 2 weeks before the attack. He described Creel saying in specific language that Emmett repeated with the careful accuracy of a man who understood that precision was now his only currency, that the situation at Broken Spur needed to be resolved before the railroad announcement, and that Maddox. He stopped. "He used a different name," Emmett said. He said the ranch needed to be cleared. That word, cleared, the same word Saya understood that had been used about her father's land. Voss's attorney was on his feet objecting with the energy of a man who has watched his defense collapse piece by piece and is now trying to contain the damage rather than prevent it. Sowell overruled him twice. Then he told the attorney to sit down and remain seated unless he had a factual objection to a specific point of testimony. The attorney sat down. He did not raise another objection. It took Judge Sowell 40 minutes to consider what he had heard. He went to his chambers, and the room waited with the particular tension of people who know an outcome is coming but cannot yet name it. The ranchers in the benches talked quietly among themselves. Voss sat at his table with his lawyers on either side and his face arranged in an expression of patience that Saya recognized as the expression of a man trying to determine which losses are acceptable and which are not. Creel had stopped looking at anything. When Sowell returned, he delivered his findings with the economy of a man who has been doing this for 30 years and understands that clarity is a form of justice in itself. Edmund Voss bound over for trial on charges of conspiracy to commit fraud, conspiracy to commit arson, conspiracy to commit cattle theft, and conspiracy to cause harm to persons on their lawful property. Bail set at a figure that communicated clearly how seriously the court regarded the charges. Tatum Creel, removed from office pending investigation, referred to federal authorities for examination of the 1873 events regarding the Apache settlement, held without bail pending the federal referral. Lieutenant Warren Bletch referred to military judicial authority with a copy of the court record transmitted to the commanding general of the territorial district. Emmett Dre reduced charges in exchange for testimony to be determined at a separate proceeding. The room received this in a silence that lasted about 3 seconds before it became something else. Not chaos exactly, but the sound of people releasing something they had been holding for a long time, which sounds different from celebration and is in some ways more honest. Voss was taken out through the side door. Creel sat in the front row for a moment after his name was called, and then he stood, and a federal deputy materialized at his elbow, and he went through the door without looking back. Saya watched him go. She had imagined this moment many times over 6 years, imagined what she might feel when it arrived. What she felt was quieter than she had expected. Not satisfaction exactly. More like the cessation of a weight she had carried for so long. She had forgotten what it felt like to carry it, only noticing now in its absence the shape it had made in her. She held her father's journal. She had brought it into this room, and it had done what her father intended it to do. The truth recorded had become the truth preserved as he had believed it would be. He had been right about the value of the record. He had been wrong about how long it would take for someone to listen. 21 years was a long time to be right. Colt appeared beside her. He did not say anything immediately. He stood next to her and looked at the front of the room where the judge's bench sat empty. Now the room beginning to clear, people moving toward the doors with the purposeful looseness of people who have witnessed something significant and want to carry the news of it out into the open air. "It's done," he said finally. "The legal part is done," she said. "The other parts take longer." He turned to look at her directly. "I know," he said. "I know it doesn't give back what was taken." She met his eyes. "No, but it's something." "It is something," she agreed. "It is a great deal more than nothing." They stood there together in the emptying room and outside the windows of the Redstone Town Hall. The July afternoon was moving toward evening, the light going golden over the mountains the way it did in this territory, the particular quality of light that belonged to no place else that she had been watching for 3 months, from the windows of Broken Spur, and had come to understand as one of the things she would not choose to leave behind. That evening, after Dutch had taken the wagon back to the ranch, and the hands had gone to the bunkhouse, and the Broken Spur had settled into its nighttime sounds, Colt asked her to walk with him. They went north from the main house, following the creek upstream for a mile until they reached the high ground, where the valley opened out below them and the mountains stood in their full evening presence, the peaks catching the last of the light, while the valley below moved into shadow. It was a place she had not been before, and she understood from the way he moved through it that it was a place he came to alone. He stopped at the edge of the rise. "I've been coming here since my father died," he said, "when I needed to think." She stood beside him and looked at the valley below. The Broken Spur was visible, its buildings clustered together in the hollow lamplight beginning to glow in the windows as the dark came on. To the south, the distant smudge of Redstone. The silver line of the creek threading through the valley floor, the dark geometry of fence lines and fields, and the shapes of neighboring ranches. The whole human arrangement of the valley laid out below them like something someone had been building for a very long time and was still not finished. Your contract ended 6 weeks ago, Colt said. I know. You've stayed. I have. He looked at the valley for a moment longer. Then he reached into his coat pocket and produced a folded document, the paper thick and official, and he held it out to her. She took it. She unfolded it. It was a deed, signed and notarized, the ink fresh. A parcel of land on the eastern boundary of Broken Spur, 40 acres bordering the creek, the best watered and most sheltered portion of the property conveyed in permanent trust to the Chiricahua Apache community, represented by its surviving members with legal protections that Prentice had apparently drafted with considerable thoroughness. She read it twice. Prentice helped me with the legal structure, Colt said. He said it's as solid as anything he's drawn up. Can't be called in, can't be seized, can't be transferred except by the community itself. She was quiet for a long moment. You cannot buy back what was taken, she said. It was what she had said to him in the kitchen of Voss's store, in another version of this conversation when she was still determining what kind of man he was. I know, he said. I'm not trying to. She looked at the deed. Then what are you doing? I'm starting where we are, he said. Not where we should be. Not where we would be if things had gone differently 6 years ago, or 20 years ago, or any other time. Starting from here with what's real, with what can actually be built. He paused. You told me once that your father believed in records because he believed truth recorded was truth preserved. I believe in land for the same reason. Land held by the right people in the right way is a truth made permanent. He looked at her. Your people need permanence. I have land. This is what I can do. She looked at the deed. She looked at the valley. She thought about her father who had shaken hands with men who lied and had still believed to the last day of his life that the proper response to that was not to stop believing, but to document more carefully. She thought about the journal sitting in her satchel, which had survived everything and had finally done what it was made to do. She thought about a train platform in April and a man reading a letter in the cold morning light, in a choice made without hesitation. I am going to need a building, she said. He looked at her. For the clinic, she said. If I am staying and I am staying, then I need a proper space. Not a corner of the main house. A dedicated building close enough to be accessible, but separate enough for patients to have privacy. She folded the deed and held it. The location near the eastern creek boundary would be appropriate. Good water access, sheltered from the north wind. The corner of his mouth moved. I'll start on the foundation next week, he said. There is also the matter, she said, of whether we are going to continue this arrangement under false terms. He was quiet. You brought me here as a healer, she said. I have been a healer here, but I have been other things as well, and we have been something to each other that is not described in the contract Dutch witnessed in your kitchen in April. She looked at him directly the way she looked at everything that required her full attention. I am not a woman who pretends not to know what she knows. No, he said, you're not. Then say what you mean to say. He turned to face her fully. Stay, he said, not under contract, not as the ranch's healer, though I hope you'll keep doing that work. Stay as my wife. Stay as my partner in everything the ranch, the clinic, whatever we build here. He looked at the valley below them, at the broken spur sitting in its hollow, with its lamplight and its repaired barn and its ordinary enduring presence. I have been alone in that house for 5 years, and I have been telling myself it was a reasonable way to live. You showed up and made it very clear that it was not. He looked back at her. I would like you to help me live differently. She held his gaze for a long moment. She thought about the girl who had watched her father's village burn and had walked away carrying a bow and a leather satchel, and the decision that survival was insufficient, that she would build something, or she would spend her life in the attempt. She thought about 6 years of building, the skills acquired, the knowledge assembled, the patience practiced until it became something like faith in the eventual arrival of the right moment. She thought about what it meant to be asked to stay, not by need but by choice. Not because she was useful, though she was. Not because she was available, though she had made herself available to this work. But because the man asking had watched her for 3 months with clear eyes and was asking with full knowledge of what he was asking. Yes, she said. The word was quiet and absolute. He reached out and took her hand, and they stood on the high ground above the valley as the last light left the mountains and the stars began to emerge one by one over the Colorado dark, and the sound of the creek came up from below, carrying its cold and constant presence, and the broken spur waited below them with its lamps burning. The wedding was held on the first Saturday of October, when the aspens along the creek had turned the particular gold of the Colorado autumn, the color that looks lit from inside. They married outdoors on the flat ground above the eastern bend of the creek, with the mountains in their full autumn presence and the sky the specific deep blue that only this territory produces in that particular season. The people who came were the people of the valley ranchers and their families, the homesteaders, the ordinary people who had filled the town hall benches in July and who now filled the meadow with the purposefulness of people who understand they are present at something that matters. Mrs. Calloway from the neighboring ranch brought 3 pies. The Peterson family drove in from 12 miles east. Brother Callum, who had started all of this with a letter and a careful endorsement, came from his mission and stood near the front with the expression of a man who has planted seeds and is watching what grew. Judge Sowell performed the ceremony. This was not required any minister would have done, but it was right in a way that went beyond legal formality. The man who had presided over the dismantling of the machinery that had tried to destroy them now presided over the beginning of what they were building instead. The vows were simple. Colt said, "I promise to see you clearly, to stand beside you honestly, and to build this life with you as a partner in every decision and every difficulty. I promise to be worth the trust you have placed here." Saya said, "I promise to bring everything I am to this life we are making. I promise to be your equal in all things and your defender in all things, and to choose this every day with full knowledge of what I am choosing." She wore her mother's beaded work at her collar, the only piece of her mother's making that she still possessed, and it caught the October light in the way that careful craft work catches light quietly and with great permanence. When it was done, Dutch shook Colt's hand and then turned to Saya and shook hers as well, which was not something he had done before and which meant precisely what it appeared to mean. Aldous Prentice had sent in lieu of attending a letter confirming that the clinic building on the eastern parcel had been legally established as a public health facility, its operating charter filed with the Territorial Health Board, its existence now a matter of record that could not be undone by any subsequent change of county administration. Truth recorded was truth preserved. The clinic opened in November before the first snow. Saya had designed it herself, working with the carpenter Dutch hired from Crestfield, specifying the layout with the same precision she brought to medical procedures, the examination space, the storage for medicines and instruments, the small room where patients who needed observation could rest. The window placement was her decision, oriented to catch the morning light from the east, because she had learned over years of early rising that there is a particular quality to the first light of a Colorado morning that she refused to deprive a sick person of. She treated everyone who came. In the first winter, she saw 34 patients from 6 different ranches addressing injuries and illnesses that would have previously required a 40-mile round trip to the nearest doctor. She delivered 2 babies. She set 1 broken wrist and 1 broken collarbone and treated a bout of fever that moved through 4 families in the valley's northern reaches. Word moved outward from the valley. By spring, people were coming from distances that would have seemed excessive for a frontier medical facility, except that the alternative was nothing. Colt ran the ranch. He expanded the herd in the second year, using the recovery of his cattle losses and the collapse of Voss's stranglehold on the valley's supply chains to operate with margins that allowed actual investment rather than mere survival. He worked with the other ranchers to establish a cooperative purchasing arrangement that eliminated the single-point dependency that Voss had exploited for 15 years. He also began quietly in the evenings to learn the Apache words she taught him. He was not gifted with languages. He knew this about himself and said so plainly, and she found this the willingness to be openly bad at something while continuing to try one of the more endearing things about him. He learned slowly and kept what he learned with a seriousness that was characteristic of how he approached everything that mattered to him. Their first child was born in the second year. A boy they named Thomas after no one in particular because they had agreed that they were not naming their children after the past. Their second child, a daughter, arrived 2 years later. Their third, another boy, 3 years after that. The children grew up knowing two languages, two ways of reading the land, two ways of understanding what the world required of a person and how to provide it. Saya taught them the medicine and the plant knowledge and the particular kind of patience that her father had taught her. Colt taught them the ranch and the land and the understanding of their neighbors and the specific frontier ethics of a man who believed that your word was the most durable thing you possessed. They argued sometimes as people who are genuine partners argue about money and about how to raise children,